Atheism gives you no ground for trusting the rationality you need to do science. So what atheism does is not only shoot you in the foot, and that's painful, it shoots you in the head, and that's fatal.
John, I heard that you wrote a little book, and it's being read around the world, called Can Science Explain Everything? Why is everyone talking about this book so much?
It addresses a feeling that's very widespread, that science has been so successful. Look at the technology it has produced. Surely in the end, it will answer everything, and push religion right out to the side, and especially any ideas of God. And I want to combat that. And I want to say that science is powerful. I love it, but it's limited. And it's easy to see that it's limited. There's a very brilliant Nobel Prize winner called Sir Peter Medawar, and he once said it's so easy to see that science is limited because it cannot even answer the questions of a child. Where do I come from? Where am I going? And what is the meaning of life? And he hit on something very important there. The late Lord Sachs, who was the chief rabbi in the United Kingdom and Commonwealth, wrote a book once. He was a brilliant philosopher. And he said something roughly like this: science takes things apart to see how they work. Religion puts them together to see what they mean. And the point is that science can answer many questions, but it cannot answer the questions of meaning. We often put it this way, that science answers mainly the how questions and the why questions of function. Why is that bit there? But it cannot deal with the why questions of purpose. And I often illustrate this by telling a story about a fictitious Aunt Matilda who's baked a beautiful cake, and there it is in front of us. And she presents it to an assembly of all the Nobel Prize winners and asks them to analyze the cake. So you get a brilliant chemical analysis, you get an analysis in terms of biology and physics, in terms of quarks and electrons and everything else. And they give you a huge and perfect analysis. And when they've finished, she says, now, just before you go, please tell me why the cake was made. And she begins to grin. And the physicist, well, he can tell what it's made of, but he can't tell why she made the cake. And nor can the chemist, and nor can anybody else, not even the mathematicians who don't get Nobel Prizes. None of them can tell her why. Only she can if she reveals it to them. Now, this is a very simple analogy, but it's hugely important because it's the same with the universe. We can examine what it's made of and get brilliant scientific theories, but to understand why it was made and why we were made, God who created it will have to reveal it to us. Now, here's the important thing. When Aunt Matilda reveals it to us, we don't shut our reason off. We use our reason to understand her revelation. And just as we use our reason to understand science, how it works, we use our reason to understand her explanation of why she made it. And it's exactly the same, because so many people think that faith is a religious word. It means believing where there's no evidence. That's nonsense. Faith is an ordinary word. It means trust, and it's as important in science as it is in any other field. And that's why I say that we need to distinguish between these two explanations.
Why are people, do you think, so committed in the academic fields to not believing in God? And they've done a fantastic job of making us think that we're the ones who believe fantastical things. But really, it's the ones who deny God who appear to me to be living in this fantasy world that out of nothing, everything comes.
Sometimes when I'm talking to scientists, I'll say, what do you do science with? And they will talk about some expensive equipment, and I point to my head and I say this. Oh, they said, you mean your, and they're about to say mind when they know that it's not politically correct to believe in the mind. So they say your brain, you do science for your brain. I say, okay, I believe the brain and the mind are separate, but that's another discussion. You do science with your brain. Give me the short history of the brain. And they come up with something like this. Well, the brain is the end product of a mindless, unguided process. And I look at them and smile and I say, and you trust it? I said, tell me honestly, if you knew that the computer that you use every day for doing your science was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, would you trust it? Now, here's the interesting thing. I have always got the answer no. And I say to them, you have a problem, don't you? Because you are giving me an explanation of your brain mind that you wouldn't accept in any other area. Atheism gives you no ground for trusting the rationality you need to do science. So what atheism does is not only shoot you in the foot, and that's painful, it shoots you in the head, and that's fatal.
You're speaking in ways that remind me of C.S. Lewis and making similar types of arguments, and it's so refreshing to hear this. Do you address in your book the objection that somebody might make, well, your Matilda argument sounds great and your teapot argument sounds great because she wanted to make the cake. There is a purpose. Someone wanted a cup of tea. But you cannot assume that the universe was made for a reason. We can pull it apart, we can describe how it works, but doesn't it just take faith to believe that there's actually a purpose and a meaning behind it all? What say there is no purpose or meaning?
Well, of course it does. You can assume that there's no purpose or meaning, but then that's the stop. And it's very interesting for a scientist to take that view, because all the time they spend, what's that for? What's the point of that? What's the purpose of this? And my friend Paul Davis, who is an Arizona State University, not a theist, he says it's very curious when science goes down and down and down and then say, well, the whole thing, you don't inquire, there's no purpose behind it all. The thing is, I'm looking for explanations that make sense, and I prefer them over explanations that make no sense. Now, here we are as people who can create our own purposes. And that's a very interesting thing. C.S. Lewis, again, made the point. Wouldn't it be very strange, he said, if we found ourselves in a world where we got thirsty and there was no such thing as water? And you see, it's like that. Our minds long for meaning and purpose. It's one of the most important things. Science doesn't give us those things, except in a limited extent, that a person can say, my purpose in life is to solve this problem. But an ultimate purpose, where's it all heading and so on, that is a crucial question. And in the end, we can assume that it's all absurd, but that's the end of the story. And what if we're wrong? And so I would much prefer to say, if you assume it's all observed, that is your faith. There are no people, and this is hugely important, there are no people today who are not people of faith. Every scientist is a person of faith. And when anybody uses the word faith when talking to me, I say, faith in what? What is your faith in? It's in something. It may be in yourself. It may be in your science. It may be in atheism, or it may be in God. What is the evidence that backs up your trust? Because that's what faith is. It's not believing where there's no evidence. It's committing yourself where there is evidence. Otherwise, you're just a bit crazy.
John, I love what you're saying, and it reminds me, as a young Christian, when I was wrestling with these issues, I wanted to have so much evidence. I wanted all the God-believing scientists to create such an airtight case that faith would not be required in order to know God, to love God, and to live with Him forever. And yet the Scriptures say that faith it's impossible to please God without faith. Faith is a gift that comes to us from God, and somehow God has stacked the deck in such a way that faith cannot be removed from the equation. Why do you think that is?
Well, because it can't be removed from any equation. I can't prove to you mathematically or scientifically that my wife, to whom I've been married for 52 years, loves me. But I believe there's enough evidence of that for me to stake my life on it. We get a bit mystified here. And we don't realize that trust, faith is something that abides, it goes all the way through. And faith in God is not simply faith in a set of propositions, like in science. Faith in science is believing certain things, equations, and the rationality of the universe. But when we're talking about God, we're talking about faith and trust in a person. And of course, we would be very unwise these days, particularly, to trust people without there being evidence. We need evidence for trust. But evidence is the thing that leads to trust. It doesn't replace it. If I want to get a mortgage from a bank, I go into a bank manager and he says, on what basis should I trust you? Well, I've got this collateral, I've got this house. Well, that doesn't displace trust. It gives them a reason for trust. That's a very different matter. So we'll never do away with trust, even in ordinary human relationships. And what I spend a lot of time doing, because the new atheists have done a marvelous job in getting people to think that atheists have no faith. They have rationality and so on. And that's sheer nonsense. Richard Dawkins says in one of his books, atheists have no faith, and then he spends about 400 pages telling us what he believes. I mean, that just is sheer nonsense. Christopher Hitchens was even worse. He once said, our beliefs are not a belief, our faith's not a faith. Because what they get confused with is the distinction between faith in a genuine self, that is, trust in something based on evidence, and blind faith, which is trust where there's no evidence.